Welcome to our program with Dr. Phyllis Leffler. I'm Matthew Silverman, the Executive Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. I'm very excited to learn with Dr. Leffler today. I grew up in Alexandria and spent most of my formative years in the Northern Virginia community. I'm eager to learn more about the Virginia community, not only as it relates to my own story, but also as the narrative is indicative of the Jewish experience throughout the South and the United States over the centuries. Thank you to the Jewish Federation of Greater DC and to all of our Virginia congregational partners for making this program possible. It is amazing how much the community has grown and flourished in recent decades. And thank all of you for joining us today. I know many of you are from Virginia and the DC area and beyond. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Dr. Leffler. And now I would like to welcome Rachel Eiches, one of our board members, to introduce our speaker. Hi, Rachel.
Thank you, Matt. I was born in Virginia in Hampton, and as a member of Temple Rodef Shalom, the largest synagogue in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I'd like to personally welcome Dr. Phyllis Leffler to the Haberman Institute community, now extended well beyond Washington, D.C. region. As a member of the Haberman Institute board, I extend a warm debt of gratitude to so many congregations in our local region and the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington for helping us bring this lecture to you today, including Agudas Achim Congregation, Congregation Olam Tikva, Etz Chaim Congregation, Northern Virginia Hebrew Congregation, Congregation Ner Shalom, Beth El Hebrew Congregation, Fokir Jewish Congregation, Temple Rodef Shalom, Congregation Share Shalom, and Chabad Lubavitch of Northern Virginia. We are so honored to have so many stellar partners tonight, and we welcome so many of you from our sponsoring congregations to our community. Our guest today, Phyllis K. Leffler, is Professor Emerita at the University of Virginia in the field of public history. In addition to 2 books on public history, she has published award-winning articles on museum exhibits and on the history of women at UVA in the Public Historian and the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography. She is also published in the Journal of the History of Ideas, French Historical Studies, Transatlantic Studies, and Ethnicities. Her interest in documenting people's lives and experiences led her to co-publish To Seek the Peace of the City, Jewish Life in Charlottesville, and to be the lead interviewer for the Lowell Viker Oral History Project housed at the UVA Library. An extensive oral history project with Julian Bond, which produced both a website and a book entitled Black Leaders on Leadership, Conversations with Julian Bond. In 2018, Leffler published Insiders or Outsiders, Charlottesville's Jews, White Supremacy and Anti-Semitism in Southern Jewish History, and is currently directing an extensive oral history project to document the Jewish history of Charlottesville residents. She is immediate past president of the Southern Jewish Historical Society. We are delighted to have the opportunity to welcome her to our community tonight to speak on topics that affect us universally and personally. If you are new to the Haberman Institute, we invite you to visit our website and to join us for our ongoing courses, Jewish enrichment programs, and Haberman Distinguished Scholar Lectures like we're about to share tonight together. Dr. Leffler will engage in a Q&A session at the end of her talk. We are such a large group tonight, 800 or more. With this, please share your questions in the Q&A format. We will not be able to address live or hand-raised questions. We've learned over the past year, this is the best way to ensure a thoughtful discussion and a warm and wonderful Zoom experience for all. And with that, the Zoom box is yours, Dr. Leffler. Welcome.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful introduction, and I thank you for it. I also want to thank the Haberman Institute for inviting me to give this talk tonight. I've been following the rich and broad array of programs, and so I'm really honored to be part of your series. My own research has largely focused on the Jews of Charlottesville, and so being invited to do this has also given me an opportunity to expand my own knowledge. And for that, I'm also very grateful. So I am now going to share my screen and hope this goes well. I suspect it will. And let's begin. My talk tonight is called Insiders and Outsiders, the Jews of Virginia. And so the first question we really need to ask ourselves is, how can Jews be both? How can they both be accepted within groups with influential power within their communities, and also seen as foreigners, as strangers, as different, as dangerous? What is it about American society and American values that creates this tension? And what is the specific story in Virginia? In the description that I offered of this talk tonight, I've proposed that the Jewish story is one of educational attainment, economic success, and engagement in government, in the arts, and in education. But I've said it's also a story of discrimination and exclusion in times when white supremacy rears its angry head. So what does white supremacy have to do with all of this? What does white supremacy have to do with the Jews of Virginia? I think the most important point I want to make tonight is that Jews are sometimes defined as white and sometimes as non-white. This, I argue, is particularly salient in the South, where race has been the defining characteristic of privilege, of white supremacy. Anti-Semitism ebbs and flows, often in direct relationship to the virulence of white supremacy. So as I talk about the history of the Jews of Virginia tonight, there are several things that I am not going to address. So I just want to be clear about that at the beginning. I'm not going to talk about the struggle through the struggle among different groups of Jews in terms of defining styles of worship. I'm not going to talk about the growth of specific communities. And while I think that's important, it doesn't really help us to understand these insider-outsider tensions. Instead, I'm going to offer us a kind of blitz overview of the Jewish history of Virginia. And the periods of time that I'm going to be focusing on are the ones that you see on your screen right now. We're going to start with the colonial era. And in talking about the colonial era, I want to start with the period from 1492 to 1776. From the late 15th century through most of the 18th century, the Jewish population in Virginia remained too small to create communities with any kind of Jewish infrastructure at all. We know that there were some Jews in different parts of the Commonwealth, but there were no extant communities. We know, for example, that those communities do not really form until the 19th century. The first known Jew to be part of the settlement of Virginia was a man called Joachim Gans, a metallurgist from Prague, who was part of Sir Walter Raleigh's Roanoke colony. And then in the 17th and 18th centuries, there are isolated Jews who appear in other places as well, listed on the slide in front of you. But there were also laws on the books, which meant that Jews did not have equal status with Christians, specifically with Anglicans, the established Church of England. Both citizenship and public office holding required taking an oath of office to Jesus Christ, and Jews could not swear to that oath. So denial of the Trinity in Anglican Virginia actually led to the loss of civil rights. I'm going to skip over a lot of these different details just in the interests of time, and because there were so few Jews that it really didn't affect a ton of people. But I think the important point that I really want to make is that from the earliest time of settlement, Jews were religious outsiders to the colony. Now, in 1776, 3 weeks before the Continental Congress met and the Declaration of Independence was drafted, the Virginia Revolutionary Convention adopted its own Declaration of Rights. Section 16 of that declaration stated that all men were entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. But even so, other legal liabilities remained on the books and continued to apply to Jews, to Muslims, and to dissenting Christians. That would mean non-Anglicans. We do know there was a discrepancy between law and practice. Although these statutes remain on the books, we also have examples of Jews who own land, who engage in lawsuits, and who did business in Virginia. But the Virginia Declaration of Rights is the first step in affording protections based on religion. 1 year later, in 1777, Thomas Jefferson proposed the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, establishing the complete separation of church and state in Virginia. Now, that statute doesn't pass until 1786, requiring the efforts of James Madison to bring it through the legislature. And once that statute passed the legislature in 1786, Jews recognized that Virginia offers fertile land for their more permanent settlement. I just might mention, just as an example, because I know there are people from Maryland on this call, that Maryland does not create such a statute for religious freedom until 1826, decades later. The people of Virginia were assisted in their sense of comfort of residing in Virginia by the words and actions of the first president of the United States. When Washington, a Virginian, took the oath of office in 1789, he received congratulatory notes and letters from individuals as well as organizations. One of those was from the Truro Synagogue in Rhode Island. And in writing a thank you for that, Washington responded with his famous statement that said that the United States government gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And he went on to say, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land to continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. So the first president of the United States, a Virginian, was very committed to the notion of religious toleration. But in Virginia, Jews now feel that they can set down roots, and mercantile centers begin to develop, mostly in Richmond and Norfolk, which become the real centers of Jewish settlement. A man by the name of Isaiah Isaacs comes to Richmond as early as 1769. He was a silversmith, and he entered into business with Jacob Cohen, who came during the American Revolution. They hold extensive real estate throughout the state. They own an inn, and Isaacs even enters the political arena in 1780, was named clerk, proving the point that the restrictive laws that I just mentioned earlier did not always apply. Another innkeeper, Manasseh, opened an establishment in the city of Manassas, now named for him, and that inn was still operating at the time of the Civil War. In Norfolk, Moses and Eliza Myers arrived from New York in 1787. They were the first known Jews to settle in Norfolk. Moses becomes a shipping merchant, builds a magnificent Federalist-style mansion, and then goes on to become superintendent of the Bank of Richmond, a member and president of the Common Council, and a personal agent to Thomas Jefferson. Similarly, in Charlottesville during colonial days, David Isaacs, brother of Richmond's Isaiah Isaacs, came to Charlottesville in the 1790s. Jefferson also had business dealings with him and with other Jewish merchants in town. In addition to selling Jefferson's overseer a ball of twine that was used to lay out the contours of the original buildings of the University of Virginia, Isaacs provides Jefferson with basic provisions: meat, butter, cheese, even a horse. But perhaps more relevant for our purposes tonight, he obtains at Jefferson's request books and pamphlets on the Jewish faith. So Jews become prominent merchants in a few towns, even as they constitute a tiny minority in their communities. By 1790, about 3,000 Jews lived in the United States, and only 200 of those were in Richmond. Richmond, of course, being the center of Jewish life at the time. 200 Jews live in Virginia, and 100 of those live in Richmond. And you can see how the numbers grow, but really grow quite slowly. By the 1820s, there are 300 Jews in Virginia, with Richmond having 200. And by the time of the Civil War, 2,000, but a full half of them live in Richmond. The Old South seemed a hospitable place for Jews. Robert Rosen, in his book, The Jewish Confederates, claims that the most tolerant of Protestant denominations, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, predominated in the South. They believed in the God of the Old Testament and respected their Jewish neighbors. So despite the early restrictions of the colonial era, Jews appear to be accepted during the early Republic, and in most places in the South had become insiders. Jews also adopt the values of the South and the country. Approximately 40% of Jewish households in America owned slaves, but 75% of Jewish families in Charleston, in Richmond, and in Savannah owned slaves. By 1830, 120 Jews in the American South owned 20 or more slaves. And during the antebellum period, a majority of Richmond Jews owned slaves, mirroring the rate of slavery, of slave ownership among all whites in the city. In Richmond, Virginia, where, as I've already said, most Virginia Jews lived, there are 5 known slave traders by 1860. As assimilated Southerners and largely insiders to the culture beginning in the late 18th century, these Virginia Jews adopted and participated in white supremacist values by owning Black human beings who they enslaved. Now, American history evolves through successive waves of immigration. At times, the United States was more open to welcoming the stranger than at others. The first large wave of immigration began between 1820 and 1860 with early Irish immigrants, many of them Catholic, accounting for about a third of all immigrants to the United States. During that same period, about 5 million German immigrants arrive, many of them Catholic, but as we'll see in a minute, that also explains the earliest waves of Jewish immigrants beyond the colonial period. In response to that, by 1849, the nation's first anti-immigrant political party, known, and everyone always laughs when I say this, known as the Know Nothing Party, was created as a backlash to the increasing numbers of immigrants. Anti-immigrant sentiment has always been a part of American history when the numbers become large enough to be a threat to those who are already here. That is often what sparks nativist sentiment. Now, the Jewish waves of immigration can be divided into three different periods. Prior to 1840, most of the Jews who arrive in the United States are of Sephardic descent or adopt Sephardic traditions. There were about 15,000 in the United States by 1840. But then with that wave of German immigration to the United States, there are 200,000 German Jews and Western European Jews who arrive by about 1880. And then starting in the 1880s and moving up to the early decades of the 20th century, by 1925, there are actually 2.5 million Jews who come to America. That third wave is less assimilated. They are poorer, they're less educated, they're more desperate. They're people who are escaping the pogroms, the violence, the dangers in Eastern Europe. But by 1925, there are, as I said, 2.5 million Jews in America. Now, the Virginia story of what happens with these waves of immigrants can be repeated in multiple cities. One thing I think is important to say that of those 200,000 Jews who come in the first wave of Ashkenazi Jews, only 1% settle in Virginia. That seems to be because Virginia doesn't have a major port, as was the case in Charleston, in Philadelphia, in New York, and so it's a place that is a little less attractive as a place for settlement. But for the most part, the Jews who come to Virginia, they engage in business, first as small shopkeepers, later as larger store owners, some with multiple establishments. And some of these names will surely be familiar to you. I'm not going to read off all the names, but you can take a quick look and see that there are particular families who really make their name in their own cities through their mercantile activities. During this first wave of immigration, the Jews of Virginia seem to have experienced little to no anti-Semitism. They prospered, establishing some of the largest stores in their communities. They engage in civic life, in economic development, in political life, and in the cultural life of their communities. As their numbers grow, some of these communities in the 19th century are able to establish cemeteries and then eventually synagogues. And so you can see that throughout the late 18th and 19th century, there are a whole bunch of synagogues that get created in Virginia. Isaiah Isaacs, the merchant that I told you about earlier, and created the first congregation in Richmond, Kahal Kadosh Beth Shalom, in 1789, the very year that Washington takes the oath of office as president. As Jews from the Germanies settle in the United States and adopt the mores of their new country, they largely find comfort in their surroundings. So now I'd like to move on and talk about the period of the Civil War. Obviously, these synagogues that I've listed here, some come before the Civil War, some after, but let's shift our focus to the period of the Civil War. Southern Jews lived in a society in which the institution of slavery was part of everyday life. Most Jewish families adopted the mores of the South. At the time of the Civil War, most Jews favored secession. Richmond's rabbis They were known as Reverend in those days. Reverend Jacobs of Beth Shalom and Reverend Mickelbacher of Beth Ahaba published their prayers for peace in the local newspapers, but they are also strong supporters of the Confederacy. They fully support slavery. Rabbi Reverend Max Mickelbacher preached during the war that slavery was divinely ordained. He said to his congregation, the manservants and maidservants thou hast given unto us, that we may be merciful to them in righteousness and bear rule over them. The enemy are attempting to seduce and invite to insurrection. Overwhelmingly, Southern Jews fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. Their reasons were many. They were grateful to the part of the country that had welcomed them. They supported notions of states' rights, free trade, and the defense of their homes, but many also supported the perpetuation of slavery. When the Civil War started and the Richmond Light Infantry Blues left for battle in 1861, 15 of its 99 members were Jews. The rabbi of Beth Ahaba's synagogue, known as the German synagogue, eventually had 6 of his sons serve in the Civil War. Jewish women gave comfort to Jewish soldiers. They made clothes in the basement of the synagogues. They served in hospitals. They took wounded soldiers into their homes. They helped bury the dead. So clearly, they were very much insiders to the life of the South and had completely accepted the values of the South. Despite the commitment of Jews to serve the South, anti-Semitism was never far, revealing the ways in which Jews knew that their outsider status could rise to the surface at any time. A common view was that Jews were citizens of no country except the Jewish nation. Some regarded them as disloyal, unpatriotic, cowardly. They needed to prove their willingness to fight. Now, we know that the Confederate Congress also had its own share of bigots and anti-Semites. Henry Foote of Tennessee attacked Judah Benjamin as Judas and claimed the Jewish Shylocks would own all the property of the Confederacy by the end of the war. But there were also anti-Semitic comments that are published in Richmond's local press, referring to the dirty, greasy Jew peddler, to Jews as extortioners of the world. The Black-Jewish relationship, based on the fact that peddlers sold goods to Blacks, bowing and cringing to Negro servants, reinforced white supremacists' views about racial hierarchies. Many believed that Jews dominated the retail trades and deeply resented it. One prominent Richmonder, a woman by the name of Sally Putnam, wrote that the signs above the shops suggested that she was living in a foreign city. And she wrote, Israel and David, Moses and Jacobs, and Hyman and Levi, Guggenheimer and Rosenheimer, and other names, other names innumerable of the ancient people were prominent, instead of the old Anglo-Saxon, which had designated the most important business firms of Richmond. I think it's really important to note the use of the term Anglo-Saxon here. Actually, we see that term being used quite a bit today, again, with a whole variety of hate groups. What is important to understand is that Anglo-Saxon clearly meant white Europeans, and Jews did not rank among that category. So even during the Civil War period, Jews are both insiders and outsiders in the life of Virginia. Following the Civil War, in city after city, Jews become engaged in civic, political, and economic life. I'd like to because I don't have time to go over this in multiple communities, just use the example of Charlottesville that I know quite a bit about. I've lived in Charlottesville since the mid 1980s. So let's just take a look quickly at Charlottesville. This can be replicated in city after city in Virginia. The community took root in the 1840s and 50s and center around three main families that came with the first wave of German immigrants. Some of those families were in fact interrelated to one another. And really in those early years, they're too small to create any kind of a real threat to the Christian dominance of the region. But a major part of this history of Charlottesville, Jewish history, centers around three founding families: the Letterman family, the Oberdorfer family, and the third family was named Kaufman. And I am sorry that I do not have a worthy 19th century photograph of the Kaufmans. Each of these families produced 10 or 12 children. They fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. They're involved in the business life of the city. The first retail stores on Main Street was established in 1852 by the Letterman family. And all three families created the largest department stores in the city. They serve on the town council and later the city council, sometimes as president. They helped create the first Chamber of Commerce in 1888. Hannah Letterman helped found the Ladies' Aid Society and the Temperance Society. Moses Kaufman and later his son Mortimer Kaufman were on the school board. Mortimer's role was so important that on the day of his funeral, all the schools in Charlottesville closed. They were involved in the economic development and cultural life of the city. All of them were also involved in leadership roles in the Democratic Party politics in the city. As Southern Democrats, they supported the Redeemer cause, the parties that formed after Reconstruction, with the goal of ousting radical Republicans and enforcing white supremacy. That included policies that disenfranchised the newly freed slaves and built the edifice of Jim Crow. They were fully insiders to the life of the South. So let's move now to the post-Reconstruction period, the period that spans from 1877 through World War II. It's a very long period of time. I hope to make some distinctions as we go. The post-Reconstruction American policies of white supremacy implemented through the Jim Crow laws from 1877 through the 1950s segregated Americans by race, denied citizenship through voting restrictions and poll taxes, create inferior access to education, healthcare, and jobs. Anti-miscegenation laws of the early 20th century prohibit whites and non-whites from marrying. Those same values of white supremacy also deny access to immigrants with the new immigration laws. Both, I would suggest to you, are racially motivated. These values directly impacted Jews, who were often considered a race that was non-white. Clearly, these new immigrants, especially from Eastern Europe, seemed alien and therefore non-white. And incidentally, I just might mention that the US Holocaust Memorial Museum links racial anti-Semitism, not religious anti-Semitism, but what they call racial anti-Semitism, to the period 1875 to 1945, the very period that I'm talking about here. Now, as the numbers of Jews in Virginia grow from 2,500 to 15,000 to 25,000 by the late 1920s, Jews clearly become more of a presence and therefore more of a threat. And the next phase of the story of Jews in Virginia must be understood in the context of both state and national policies. In 1901, Virginia drafts a new constitution that remains in effect until 1971. Let me say that again. A new constitution created in 1901 that remains largely in effect until 1971. This constitution is viewed as an important example of post-Reconstruction efforts to restore white supremacy in the American South by disenfranchising large numbers of Blacks and working class whites. It shaped much of Virginia politics in the 20th century, a politics dominated by a conservative Democratic Party. Virginia Democrats were led by the famous, or maybe I should say infamous, Harry Byrd, who was active in state politics from 1915 to 1965. He helped create what was called the Byrd Machine, a small oligarchy who controlled political office holders, administered poll taxes, and ensured that only 10 to 12% of adults cast ballots. These were pro-business, anti-union white supremacists. The University of Virginia, the flagship state university, trained and educated many of the state's legislators. Views that openly articulated the inferiority of African Americans were held by those at the top echelons of the university. They become the people who helped create the intellectual architecture of white supremacy. They include people like Paul Barringer, the chairman of the faculty before there was even a president and superintendent of the UVA hospital. People like Harvey Jordan, who's dean of medicine, hired in 1907, becomes dean of medicine in the late 1930s. And Ivy Foreman Lewis, who comes to the university in 1915 and becomes Dean of Arts and Sciences in 1964. These men trained generations of students in the principles and techniques for race purification through the study of eugenics. They support the creation of Virginia's Anglo-Saxon clubs. There comes that word again, Anglo-Saxon. The purpose of the Anglo-Saxon clubs is, quote, to preserve the purity of the white race and to maintain the qualities and purposes of the Anglo-Saxon race. A major accomplishment of the Anglo-Saxon clubs is the passage of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, making it unlawful for whites to marry a non-white person. And then other white supremacy acts follow. I might just say as an aside that at the very same time that these racial integrity acts are being passed, statues in support of a lost cause mythology venerating the Old South go up across Virginia, the very statues that have caused so much distress and consternation and questioning about whether or not they can be taken down. But this is the very period when white supremacy laws are at their apex. Also, during the 1920s, there's a resurgence of the KKK. In 1915, the second KKK forms in Atlanta, Georgia. The Klan targets African Americans, Catholics, Jews, immigrants. It never gained a really large foothold in Virginia because of elites who objected to its crass methods, but who nonetheless support white supremacy through the Anglo-Saxon clubs. And even so, individual chapters of the Klan form in many cities in Virginia. There's a long history in the United States and Western Europe when Jews were considered a race, a nation apart, and Jews are considered non-white. Some obviously still think so, and obviously there are many non-white Jews too. But Jews were considered a race and part of a racial hierarchy in which they were deemed lesser. In 1910, a book called The Jew, a Negro appears. It was written by a man called Arthur Talmadge Abernathy, a PhD from North Carolina. This book goes through at least 10 editions. It was incredibly popular. And anti-Semitism was a part of the institutional racism in America that sets Jews apart and leads to discrimination, to social segregation, and to its most extreme, in Germany, to genocide. Arthur Talmadge Abernathy, in this book, tried to talk about the physical features, the mental attributes, the sexual appetites of Jews, and to claim in the most derogatory ways that he could imagine that that these were attributes that were shared by Jews and Negroes alike. It's during this period of time that universities become more restrictive. The very Ivy Foreman Lewis, who taught eugenics at the University of Virginia while he was dean of the college, he kept careful lists for the university, distinguishing between Virginians, non-Virginians, and Hebrews. Jews find themselves restricted from hotels and country clubs across America and also in Virginia. The Kaufman sons of Charlottesville that I spoke about were among the co-founders of the Farmington Country Club in Charlottesville. But when Farmington refuses to admit their Jewish friends, they withdraw their membership. The very Jews who were bastions of civic and cultural life in their communities find themselves banned from places like the Princess Anne and Cavalier Club in Virginia Beach, the Commonwealth Club in Virginia, also started by a Jew, and from hotels and neighborhoods and universities. Housing covenants and loan restrictions are put into place. Yes, all across America, but also in Bethesda, in Chevy Chase, in Northern Virginia, in Washington, D.C., and elsewhere throughout Virginia. As new immigrants from Eastern Europe settle throughout the United States in larger numbers, they understand that the environment was one in which they would need to keep a low profile. Is it any wonder that there are far fewer examples during this period of time in these years of Jews rising to political prominence or taking on important civic roles in their cities? Jews in the South were often fearful, and for good reason. Leo Frank, a factory superintendent from New York who came to Atlanta, Georgia in 1908, was charged with the murder of Mary Fagan at the factory in 1913. Mary Fagan was a young 13-year-old girl. An African-American janitor, Jim Conley, was the last person to see her alive. Frank was framed by Conley and found guilty at his murder trial. And although Georgia's governor, John Slayton, commuted the sentence, Frank was kidnapped and lynched before he could be released. In the hierarchy of race, the fact that a Jew was less trusted than an African American struck immense fear throughout Jewish communities in the South. In the 1920s, the reemergence of the Klan meant that it also dominated local and state politics in many places. Hatred of immigrants, of Blacks, of Jews, of Catholics caused Jews in many parts of the country to keep their heads down and to not make any waves. In Norfolk, Malcolm Stern, the rabbi of Temple Ohef Shalom, he was rabbi there from 1947 to 64. He writes that in the period between the Civil War and World War II, no Southern rabbi seems to have made any attempt to deal with the race question. The fear of anti-Semitism, which reached its peak with the trial of Leo Frank in Atlanta, remained so pervasive throughout the South that few, if any, Jewish laymen or rabbis would have had the courage to speak out on so unpopular an issue as the rights of Blacks. Eric Goldstein, the author of a book called The Price of Whiteness, I really recommend that if anybody wants to read further on this. It's really an excellent, excellent book. He contends that, quote, in the age of Jim Crow, the status of Jews in the South was contingent on a high degree of conformity to the prevailing racial mores. With the emergence of social discrimination in the 1880s, Southern Jews realized that an unambiguous assertion of their whiteness was necessary to prevent the further erosion of the unparalleled acceptance they had long enjoyed. Now, the period we're talking about, of course, leads right up to World War II. And in the 1920s, the 1930s, of course, we know that this is the very period when we see the rise of fascism in Europe. We also see the rise of fascism in the United States. And as people become more aware of the Holocaust, there are Jews in Virginia who really try to rescue people from Europe, some of them successfully, in fact. They too sometimes become subject to anti-Semitic responses for their efforts to do so. But what I really want to talk about now is Zionism and the way in which Zionism is the way in which Zionism is approached through large parts of the South. So while Jews could raise vast sums of money for displaced Jews of Europe, that unity fell apart when it came to raising money for the Jewish colonies in Palestine. In 1885, the Reform Jewish leaders met in Pittsburgh and adopted an 8-point platform. The 5th point of that platform denied any desire to return to Palestine and directly rejected the notion of a dual loyalty. It said, we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, etc., nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. The Reform response was also antagonistic to the Balfour Declaration in November 1917. And in 1918, a meeting of the CCAR rejected the idea that Palestine should be a national homeland for the Jewish people. The chair of that committee was none other than Rabbi Edward Kalish of Richmond, rabbi of Beth Ahaba. Beth Ahaba in Richmond becomes a fortress of anti-Zionist sentiment. Rabbi Malcolm Stern contended that Southern Jews accepted, quote, with fervor, the Pittsburgh platform. He wrote, for the majority of Southern Jews and their rabbis, America was their Zion, and they wanted no other. This too, I believe, is part of a philosophy of their complete assimilation to their new homeland. In the post-World War II environment, we all know that there was a tremendous focus on civil rights, on finally addressing the restrictions that so many Blacks had been subject to, and the segregation of so many facilities, of schools, of water fountains, of trains, etc. The civil rights movement presented Southern Jews with a dilemma. They understood themselves to be part of a persecuted minority. For the most part, they were not ardent segregationists, but they had a marginal status within Southern white society and mainly remained silent. The civil rights crisis sparked an explosion of anti-Semitic extremism across the South, with segregationists accusing communist Jews of attempting to destroy democratic government. There were some rabbis who worked quietly between the scenes, especially in the context of interracial dialogue and interreligious dialogue. Theirs were the, quote, quiet voices of resistance, the name of a book by Mark Bauman, known as The Quiet Voices, in which he traces the position that various Southern rabbis took. Some even spoke out, trying to convince their congregants to live up to the words they read in the Union Prayer Book about justice, seeking to be the ethical conscience of their communities. But they often did so at the peril of their jobs. For the most part, Southern Jews had to fight against fear, the title of another very fine book by Clive Webb on the subject of Southern Jews and Black civil rights. In Virginia, the Malcolm Stern of Temple Ohaf Shalom in Norfolk, we've already talked about him. He participated in some interracial services and even with an interracial choir, which resulted in a panicked temple board that wanted to censure him. He was only saved, his job was only saved by virtue of the fact that some Protestant ministers came to his defense. The one rabbi I'd really like to talk about here, though, is Rabbi Emmett Frank of Temple Beth El in Alexandria. For those of you who are in Alexandria, maybe you know this story about Rabbi Frank. He emerges as the one rabbi in Virginia who is willing to speak out in a very public way against segregation. It was in 1958, at the height of the massive resistance movement against school integration. And on Yom Kippur Eve, he assaulted Senator Harry Byrd. These are some of his words. "Let the segregationists froth and foam at their madness. Godliness, or to coin a new synonym, birdliness. Birdliness, meaning the policies of Harry Byrd, of course, has done more harm to the stability of our country than McCarthyism." Infuriated by this sermon, Virginia's largest segregationist group, known as the Defenders of State Sovereignty, demanded that Virginian Jews move quickly to refute and condemn Rabbi Frank. The response of the congregation led to an emergency meeting about his future. But fortunately, the president of the congregation, Leroy Bentheim, remained loyal to Frank. And it did not hurt that Leroy Bentheim also happened to be the mayor of Alexandria at the time, and that 11 Protestant ministers agree to support Frank. So Frank survived as the rabbi of the congregation, and 5 years later was given tenure at the congregation. Now, in the years since 1960, Virginia's Jewish population has exploded, especially in recent decades, growing from, sorry, I'm trying to move this forward for you. Okay, growing from 31,000 people in 1960 to over 95,000 in 2013. Much of this growth, as I'm sure many of people on the call know, has been in the Washington, D.C. suburbs of Northern Virginia. Part of that has been spawned by the growth of the federal government, by the building of the Pentagon in Northern Virginia, by the construction of Dulles Airport, and the Capitol Beltway. Federal workers and contractors flood into suburban Northern Virginia during the post-World War II era. And the numbers just grow exponentially. By the 1980s, about 75 to 85% of Jews in the South had come from the North. That dramatically changed the dynamic of fear and tacit support for the status quo. This, despite the fact that Jews remain a tiny minority of the population of Virginia, never exceeding 2%. Between 2003 and the present, there has even been a further explosion. The latest data I could find showed that between 2003 and 2017, the Jewish population in Northern Virginia increased by about 80%. So in the period since the 1960s, we also see Jews becoming much more involved again in politics. They're mayors of numerous Virginia cities: Harrisonburg, Newport News, Lynchburg, Danville, Martinsville, Winchester. One woman, Myra Obendorf, was Virginia Beach's longest serving and first female mayor, leading the city from 1988 to 2009. And Jews, of course, have emerged as very important civic leaders and also political leaders throughout the state. Yet today, we live in troubled times. So even though we see that Jews seem to have taken their place in all of these different ways, we also know that in 2019, well, actually in the past several years, we've seen a dramatic rise in hate crimes in the United States. The FBI reported 7,314 hate crimes, an increase of 200 from 2018. But the important statistics that I want to bring to your attention is that in that report, they noted that 56% of hate crimes were motivated by race, ethnicity, ancestry bias. And then they also had a different category in which 21% were due to religious bias. Of those due to religious bias, 60% were anti-Jewish, and the second largest number, 13%, were anti-Muslim. In 2019, the ADL tracked 2,107 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. And Virginia is a place of particular concern because in the Virginia State Crime Report, 44 of those 44 of crimes motivated by bias against religion, 44 were crimes motivated by bias against religion, and 22 of those were anti-Jewish. So 50% of hate crimes in Virginia based on religious bias were directed toward Jews in a state in which 1.8% of the population is Jewish. So I'd just like to conclude by asking a couple of questions. How should we think about this insider-outsider history that I've been describing? White supremacy, white nationalism, now a theory of white replacement that we're hearing more and more about, the theory that native-born Americans are being replaced in a powerful way by immigrants who will permanently transform the landscape of this very nation. So said Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry. These ideas put Jews in peril because as much as Jews have assimilated, achieved some of the highest positions in education, business, political, and civic life, we are still viewed as outsiders by those who espouse white nationalist values. Remember 2017 in Charlottesville? You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. And remember the insurrection at the US Capitol this past January when Robert Packer of Newport News, Virginia, appeared wearing a black sweatshirt and the words Camp Auschwitz in large letters. So we must remain vigilant, but we must also look within and ask ourselves, a very difficult question. To what extent have our ancestors aided and abetted those white supremacist values? Values that were simply assumed to be prevailing truth. To what extent do we continue to adopt some of those values as we are accepted and rewarded as insiders? Those are personal questions we all need to take very seriously. So thank you so much for your attention and my quick blitz through Virginia Jewish history tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Leffler. That was a very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I imagine all of us are left to really reconcile with the questions you left us at the end. I know my own family history has people who came from Germany in the 1800s and others from Eastern Europe, and both we're here at different times. So our ancestry is a lot to reckon with. I'm looking over at some of the questions now. There's a question here. Were Jews considered a racial category legally at any point, or was it more enforced by individuals and non-government institutions?
So I think the answer is that Jews that it was not a legal category, but it was certainly a set of principles and values that, as we think about the hierarchy of race, made Jews feel very anxious and very nervous, and recognized that that at any moment they would be, that they would be the objects of that kind of discrimination that African Americans were experiencing all the time. So I don't think it was written into law in any way, but I think it was certainly a set of values and assumptions and expectations. And as I said earlier, I think this is worth commenting on. I'm reminded of the very, very powerful book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste, which I just finished reading a few weeks ago, in which she makes the claim, and I think very persuasively, that America really is a caste society, and that there are hierarchies, there are rungs on a ladder, so to speak, of where you fit in terms of the hierarchy of race. Now, we don't really think of Jews as a racial category, but the Encyclopedia Britannica, when I looked up the term anti-Semitism, actually defines anti-Semitism as hatred and intolerance against Jews based on both religious and racial categories. So maybe not legally enshrined in law, but certainly something that was very, very widely believed.
Yeah, thank you. The did Virginia colleges and universities have quotas for Jewish students? Do you know?
As far as I know, they did not have actual quotas, but they certainly did have very careful records and data and statistics that they kept, limiting the number of Jews that they would accept. I know, for example, that at the University of Virginia, as I think I said, that Dean Ivy Lewis for decades kept these records about Virginia, about students applying to the University of Virginia. And he had 3 different categories, 3 different lists, which he regularly passed on to the president of the university. And the 3 different categories were Virginians, non-Virginians, and Hebrews. So there were very, very careful records being kept, and particularly the fear was somehow that Southern universities in Virginia that were, that espoused their own certain kinds of values would be overrun by Northern Jews. The greatest fear was that it would be Northern Jews, because the fear was that Northern Jews would not really accept the values and the mores of the Old South. And, Southern universities, well, particularly places like the University of Virginia, which I know the most about, were very elitist institutions. And, so for every story in which you hear about Jews that had miserable experiences, there are stories about Jews who had very fine experiences. So I always like to tell the story about the University of Virginia. I know we're getting a little bit away from the question of quotas, but I still think that it's a valuable story to tell. A man who became the rector of the Board of Visitors at UVA, who came to the university in the 1930s. His name was Mortimer Kaplan. Of course, he was the co-founder of Kaplan and Drysdale in Washington, D.C. He was on the law faculty at UVA. He came to UVA in the 1930s as a student, and he loved his time here. He thought it was just a great place. He was on the, I think on the boxing team and in the drama club. The very, very same years that he was here, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet, Carl Shapiro, came to the University of Virginia. He was the nephew of one of the Eastern European merchants in Charlottesville, who had sort of invited down and suggested he apply here. Carl Shapiro, as I said, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning poet, writes this poem that he calls "To Hurt the Negro and Avoid the Jew is the Curriculum." It's like a 3-stanza poem that goes on. He hated it, and he left after about 6 months. But the distinction was really that it was really as much a distinction of class as it was a question of actual virulent anti-Semitism. So going back to the question, I don't know of any universities in Virginia that had absolute quotas, but they certainly had very careful monitoring techniques to make sure that there would never be too many Jewish students at one time.
Yeah, thank you. And as a follow-up, I have a couple of other university-related questions, wondering if there were maybe quotas on faculty, and another question here about fraternities and whether or not there was, as an example, whether or not that was a good example of racism, or I don't know if you want to speak to either of those.
I'll need clarification on the second part, but on the first part, I absolutely know. And again, I'm really going to speak about University of Virginia, where I've done most of my research. I can't really comment on all the other universities. I'm sorry, something I'd like to someday learn more about. But at the University of Virginia, there were just a handful of Jewish faculty before 1960. Just a handful. And some of them didn't even really identify Jewishly. Some of them couldn't escape identifying because of their names. There was someone called Ben Zion Linfield, I think in the mathematics department. But they were just, they were just sprinkled in different departments, and they never, and there were never enough Jews here to really be any kind of a community even within the university. And therefore, a place like Charlottesville, and I think virtually every Southern university town, was a history in which there are just a very, very small number of Jews in these places before the universities begin to open up. I know, for example, that the history of Charlottesville is one in which, and it always amazes me to say this because we have a very vibrant Jewish community today, but Charlottesville had no full-time rabbi until 1979. No full-time rabbi until 1979. There were visiting rabbis for the holidays, and sometimes the Hillel rabbi, who was hired for university students, would share certain duties and obligations. But there was a large community in Charlottesville to be able to support a rabbi. And that changes when the university opens up to Jewish faculty, which it does in the 1960s. And it does largely, it does largely because there are certain chairpersons of departments who are forward thinking, who want the university to develop more of a national reputation rather than a regional reputation, and also presidents of the university who were more open to that. So really, once that happens, into the medical school, into the law school, into the college, you see so many more Jewish faculty starting to come in the 1960s, and that transforms the university and it transforms the city as well. And I think that can be replicated in many places. Now, Matthew, can you tell me what the second part of that question was about fraternities? Because I'm not quite sure I understand.
Sure, I'll read the question here for you. The question is, would you address fraternities accepting Jews as an example of racism? I don't know if you
or excluding Jews. Accepting Jews as a form of racism?
Yeah, well, I mean, whether or not the fraternities were accepting of Jews, if you have any knowledge of that.
I see. Okay, so I like to think about white supremacy as a big umbrella, and I think under that canopy of that umbrella, there are multiple things that sort of come underneath that umbrella. I think obviously racism is a piece of it, and anti-Semitism is a piece of it. Xenophobia is a piece of it. Anti-Muslim attitudes are a piece of it. So exclusion within social clubs, especially when you are defining people in racial terms or thinking of them potentially as part of a race, is a form of racism. I would argue it is a form of racism. Others would argue, well, people have a right to socialize with their own, and if it's more comfortable to do it that way, then so be it. But the actual exclusion within social clubs, I think based on anti-Semitism. Remember, I said anti-Semitism is a racial category or thought of in racial terms between 1875 and the end of World War II. Anti-Semitism is also prejudice and intolerance against a minority religion. So it's both. So if the exclusion from fraternities is based on religious bias, then you might argue, well, then that's, then that's not racism. But I don't think that's ever the reason. I don't think that's ever the reason. I think much more typically it is because Jews are defined as other, and they can only be defined by other because they're typecast in some way in terms of a hierarchy of insiders and outsiders, which I think is often based on racial terms.
Thank you. There's a question that's reflecting back on today. Much of the history, with the exception maybe of Rabbi Frank, and I'm sure others, seems to indicate that Jews mainly reacted to their situation by adapting and conforming rather than seeking change. And is there a reason to think this is different today in the community? And if you also wanted to, if you wanted to or able to maybe speak about the relationship of the Jewish and the African American community today, if those two questions combine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's it's a very important question. And is there reason to believe it's different today? So I think one of the things I was trying to say at the end of my talk, and also moving it along so we'd have some time for questions, is that as the numbers grow, and as in this case Jews become more comfortable in their surroundings, I think risk taking is more possible and also more desirable. I also want to hope that we live in a time of increased sensitivity to the kinds of institutional racism that have been a part of this country, and are better able to see how each of us individually might be able to step out and make a difference. So at the same time, of course, as I also said at the end, the rise of hate crimes is terribly frightening. And the kinds of attacks that have taken place on synagogues, from the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh to Poway in California, the kinds of attacks on African American churches, on most recently Asian American women. This is enough to create lots and lots of fear and unwillingness to take risks at the same time. So I don't know if it's different today. I certainly hope it is. I certainly hope that that many of us feel somewhat more confident in our place in the current society and climate, and are able to see a little bit more effectively this this way in which we all have a responsibility. So, I don't know that that's a very good answer. In terms of Jews and African Americans, I'm hopeful that in the wake of this absolute spate of murders of African Americans, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and the joining of that movement by so many white Americans in support, I'm hoping that that will open up some new avenues for opportunity and cooperation. I think there have been decades in which there has been a lot of tension between African American communities and Jewish communities. But my view, my personal view, and I can only really speak for myself, is that if we don't see ourselves as all having a shared purpose in terms of combating this white supremacy, we do so at our own peril, because we all become vulnerable, I think. So that's all I think I have to say on that topic.
Yes, thank you. And I have a note here from one of our participants who I didn't, in case it came across in either of our talks, there, the other people also stood up, clearly stood up for against racism. And I see here Rabbi Marvin Bash stood with his congregation against the Nazi Party. So he's so.
And Rabbi Bash is with what congregation?
It looks like my note says Congregation Eitz Chaim.
Uh-huh.
So,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'm sure there are other examples. I was just suggesting that Rabbi Emmett Frank was most spoken of those rabbis in Virginia. I'm sure there are other examples too that you know in which people had the courage of their convictions and were able to speak out. But also, I mean, speaking out against the Nazi Party, certainly important. I wouldn't say it's not. I think that's a little bit different than speaking out against segregation, because speaking out against the Nazi Party is a self-interested Jewish thing to do. Speaking out against segregation was not necessarily a self-interested Jewish thing to do. So I would make that distinction.
thank you. There's another question here that maybe you have some experience with, but it's about like about the networks in the South, whether or not, when the communities were much smaller, whether they were in Charleston or Savannah or Richmond, were there networks where the community could get together and I see this person noted here, but maybe Jewish summer camps to meet each other. Do you have any stories about that? Or
Well, I know such camps did exist, and I also know that there were various kinds of ways in which young Jewish women could come and meet young Jewish men. I know, for example, that there was a network that went from Lynchburg to Charlottesville to Baltimore. It was kind of along a major mercantile route, so to speak, but that there were often efforts, to introduce young men to young women in these other communities, to have dances and things of that sort. Certainly Jewish camps were well known throughout the South and other parts in the country where people could meet one another. I think that's perhaps a way in which Jews could develop their own sense of identity, obviously separate from the rest of the society. Did not need to assimilate. Did not need to integrate into the larger community. I didn't speak about that tonight because I don't really, it doesn't really address the major thrust, the major topic that I really wanted to focus on, which is insiders and outsiders. To the extent that there are summer camps and continue to be Southern summer camps. My own son went to such a camp in North Carolina, to Camp Judea, where he met tons of Jewish friends. Because I can assure you that growing up in Charlottesville also meant that there weren't, even in the 1980s and early 1990s, there weren't that many Jewish kids, to befriend and to develop social circles with. So Jewish camps have always been important in creating that sense of cultural identity and social identity. And in that sense, they separate Jewish kids out, but there are important values in that too, in terms of helping Jews to feel, confident within themselves, to help them have a strong sense of self-identity.
thank you. There's still a good number of questions. We'll try to maybe just answer one or two more of the. Let me see here. There's one on Uriah Levy. I'm not sure if it's Levy or Levy. Bought and restored Monticello. Was he ever subject to anti-Semitic attacks? Is that? And
Absolutely, he was. Absolutely. And that was in my original talk, and in the interests of time, I just couldn't do it all. So I'm really glad that question's been asked, because I can comment on that one. So Uriah Phillips Levy was a Sephardic Jew from New York. he was extremely distinguished. He was in the United States Navy and an officer in the Navy. And in 1834, he purchases Monticello after Thomas Jefferson died and maintains Monticello until the Civil War, when it's taken over by the Confederacy. Then there is some interim period when the whole question of who owns Monticello and what's going to be done with it is in dispute. But ultimately, his nephew, Jefferson Monroe Levy, repurchases Monticello and manages to preserve it and hold on to it until 1924, when the Thomas Jefferson Foundation buys it and makes it a public history site. That will be preserved from that point on. So these two levies, Uriah Phillips Levy and Jefferson Monroe Levy, are absolutely critical for close to 100 years in the preservation of Monticello. Uriah Phillips Levy loved Jefferson, and one of the reasons he loved Jefferson as much as he did was because of Jefferson's view on religious toleration. He believed that he was subject to much anti-Semitic attack within the Navy himself. He was flogged various times, etc. He definitely believed those were anti-Semitic reasons. And Jefferson Monroe Levy, and again, these are incredibly distinguished people from New York. They're members of Congress, and they are unbelievably wealthy individuals, all the right contacts. But when Jefferson Monroe Levy is holding on to Monticello for as long as he's able to do so, there are people who come along and say, we don't want Monticello being held by the aliens, and I can't remember exactly the terms that they were used, but it was definitely anti-Semitic code language. So the Levy family did incredible service in terms of preserving Monticello for the future, poured into Monticello enormous resources, and were not necessarily beloved for doing so. But they did it anyway. So we have them to thank.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. I see we're about out of time here, and I don't know if you have any final thoughts for us, or I know you've said a lot, so no.
Well, I guess I would just say that as I have had the opportunity to look at this history and reflect on it, I have gone through my own evolution to some degree. And I think that's what I would really like to share with the audience tonight. So I started researching the history of Charlottesville in the 1990s. And I came to have just enormous admiration for these founding Jewish families that I spoke of tonight. I thought, isn't this amazing? These are 19th century Jews. They're a tiny minority. They're the leaders of the community. They start the banks. They're civic leaders. They're promoters of the arts, etc. And it's really, this is a sort of confession on my part, but it's only very recently that it hit me that these were the people who entered local and state politics to help create that architecture of white supremacy. And so these founders of the community that I live in, that I've always admired from afar and felt like, I would have liked to have been like them. And now, I come to understand that that they were really part of the problem that has that has been embedded in this country for generations. And so that's, I think, why I would really like people just to reflect on that a little bit more and to think about this insider outsider issue. As I said, this book by Eric Goldstein called The Price of Whiteness. Let me just see, hold on just a second. The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity. I think this is a fabulous book in terms of really exploring that the complexities of that. And I just think it's incumbent upon all of us to reflect as deeply as we can on that, what I would just consider a dilemma.
Thank you again. It's such a thought-provoking lecture, and I'm sure all of our participants have so much to wrestle with. I know I do. I'm filled with reflecting on my own family's history and the community's history and our world today. So thank you again. And I'm seeing lots of comments in the Q&A. People are saying the same thing. So I know we appreciate it. Everybody's appreciated this evening. So
well, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. It's been a real pleasure.